This past week, as many of you probably know, Senator Cory Booker made history. For more than 25 hours, he held the floor of the Senate by delivering a really powerful speech about the meaning of democracy in the ways in which he feels that this particular administration is destroying it. In a video that he recorded before his speech, he explained that he had been hearing from people all over his state and all over the nation about the need for Congress to do something, to do more, to recognize the urgency of this particular moment. He said we all have a responsibility to do something to cause, in what John Lewis's words, he said, were getting into good trouble. And he said that included himself. In his video, he said, "Tonight I will rise with the intention of getting in some good trouble because I believe sincerely that our country is in crisis, and I believe that not in a partisan sense, because so many people have reached out to my office in pain, in fear, in having their lives upended, so many of them identifying as Republicans." So he said during his speech, these are not normal times and they should not be treated as such. And before his speech had ended, the Washington Post reported that the speech had over 400 million likes on TikTok. Now, some of you this morning may be saying, well, is it really appropriate to talk about politics during a worship service? And I understand that. Those of you who have heard me over the years know that I seldom talk about politics, well, maybe in an offhanded way, but it's not usually my main topic. But I agree with Booker that we are living in unprecedented times, and for the few months, it has been making me increasingly anxious. The rapid-fire decisions of this administration are unprecedented. I believe in democratic systems. That democratic systems is actually one of the things that we as Unitarian Universalists covenant to promote. And so this administration, it seems to me, despises our democratic system. They want to totally ignore the other two parts of the system, Congress and the courts. And so my anxiety is in large part nonpartisan and grounded in my belief in our democratic system. This is a historical moment. And I believe we are called to take action on behalf of the values that we have covenanted to uphold as Unitarian Universalists, on behalf of all of those who have been negatively impacted so far, but also on behalf of democracy. We are being called to transform our faith into a more courageous and creative movement. And also, I'm reminded that if you go back and listen to some of my sermons from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you go back to sermons from some of our most famous Unitarian and Universalist ministers from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, they will all say, we live in unprecedented times. the times that Jesus was in, Muhammad was in, Buddha was in, all historical moments that were unprecedented. And each time we are asked, what is being asked of us now as people of faith? What is being asked of us now as people of faith? This is a perennial, time-worn question that right now we do well not to ignore. And that's the question, my friends, that is making me so anxious right now. Just recently, I had a week where I attended 4 political meetings. The first was a community organizing meeting in Durham, and the second was a precinct meeting for my party. The third was a Friday action hour put on by our UU Justice Ministries organization led by Reverend Lisa. And the fourth was an indivisible meeting in Durham. Now, all of these meetings were really important. They're great. They are wonderful ways of getting important information, collaborating, taking collective action. But I have to tell you that by the end of the week, I found myself even more anxious and asking myself, how can I do more? How can I do more? Because this is all so important. And then I found myself kind of emotionally twitching and spiraling in an anxious soup. And when I took some time to really feel those feelings, I realized, this is just what this administration wants. They want us all stewing in an anxious soup, because that makes us unable to think creatively. And then at the end of that week, as so often happens gracefully, I had a moment of synchronicity because I had brunch with a couple of friends, one of which is a life coach and the other is a therapist. And they were talking about this new book by Martha Beck, who's a life coach, called Beyond Anxiety. And I had to buy the book because I thought, well, she's talking about me, right? How do you get beyond anxiety in this historical moment? Beck begins her book by talking about the unbelievable level of anxiety that we all felt at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Anybody remember what that felt like 5 years ago? That experience, she said, taught us a very important lesson, that the best way to ease anxiety is to ramp up our creativity. She said people started knitting and baking bread and taking up woodworking and all kinds of other creative endeavors, not just because they were bored at home, but because it helped them be less anxious. There's a lot of scientific evidence that demonstrates that anxiety is a left-brain activity, and that it happens when our left brain comes up with logical answers, statistical answers about why we're uncomfortable, but it has the inability to solve the problem. And so we spiral into this more and more anxious feeling. Now, as I talk about left brain and right brain, I realize that I'm oversimplifying this whole thing because it's the way our brains work is very complex. But there's some wisdom here, so hear me out. When we get into this anxious state, our brains twitch, and we just keep using our left brain in a spiral. And Beck says we need to remember that the only way out of that spiral is to use our right brain, to engage our emotions, our feelings of connection, our senses, our artistic proclivities, our intuitions. Our logical, analytical, verbal left brain and our sensing, perceiving, emotional right brain are designed to toggle back and forth throughout our day. But anxiety keeps us locked, stewing in an anxious soup, shutting down our creativity. And it's our creative thinking, my friends, that's needed right now to solve our biggest problems. Reading more statistics is not going to help us. Looking at one more broadcast of news or blog is not going to help us out of our anxiety. So as I was reading Beck's analysis of this, I was reminded of a time several years ago when I was a ministerial intern with the Reverend Charlie Cast in Chapel Hill. And there were things that would keep me up at night. I would get into an anxious spiral and, my brain would keep thinking. And his advice to me was to focus on my senses. So lie there and think, what am I smelling right now? What am I tasting? What are my fingers feeling? What do I hear? And I found that going through this sensual practice, I often would not get through all of my senses before I was fast asleep, because I was able to toggle my brain away from my left brain anxiety to my right brain sensing. I think our right brain is where our joy, our deepest joy, resides. What the pandemic reminded us of was that anxiety cannot be ended by thinking ourselves out of it. It can only be ended by being replaced. It has to be replaced with joy, joyful moments, with feelings that generate our curiosity, our wonder, our connection, our compassion. So when activists tell us that when we meet people that don't agree with us, we should not try to match statistic with statistic, we should listen, we should be curious, we should be compassionate. It's because that switches us over to right brain thinking, right? One of my favorite stories from Beck's book about anxiety is about a woman named Frida who happened to come to one of her workshops. And she said Frida had some really good reasons to be anxious. Frida had some allergies and clinical sensitivities that were so severe that she was always in danger of a fatal asthmatic attack. Can you imagine? So Frida had this service dog named Griffin, a border collie, who had been trained to sniff out any chemicals that might be offensive to Frida. And if he smelled danger, he would alert her, and if need be, he would actually pull her away from any chemicals that might be dangerous for her. Now, Beck says that Frida was very anxious sitting there in the workshop, but Griffin, sitting next to her, was absolutely calm. And when Beck mentioned how disciplined Griffin was, Frida said, well, yes, he's very disciplined, but there's only one problem that we have found. He can't resist squirrels. He's always looking for a squirrel. And when he sees one, if I let him, he will chase that squirrel for hours. And then she added, sometimes when he chases squirrels, I get this weird feeling that he feels like that's part of his job. He looks at me like he's trying to tell me something. And as I read this story, I thought, wow, I have been feeling like a service dog in a world devoid of squirrels. What if, even though there are clearly bad things happening, what if I could remember there are squirrels everywhere? What if I could think of squirrel chasing as part of my job? Having fun, taking time to play, to be joyful. What if this anxiety that I've been feeling that feels like it just keeps spiraling out of control is just a sign that is telling me I need to spend more time off leash? Going off leash for me means intentionally toggling to the right side of my brain every once in a while. And so after I read this book, I started making a list of all the ways I would love to go off leash. How do I tell whether I'm using the right brain or left brain? For me, the easiest way to tell is if I can't listen to music while I'm doing something, I'm probably too deeply into my left brain. So, right brain activities for me are things like gardening, cooking. I won't tell you all of them, but those are two that I'll mention this morning. I want to commit myself to spending some time every day going off leash to help control my anxious thoughts. Because I realize this is the wellspring from which my activism comes. And when I say activism, I use that word in its broadest sense. Anyone who is activating their gifts and talents and determination to do something they believe in is an activist in my book. The kind of good trouble John Lewis and Carrie Booker talked about requires the creativity of the right brain. It is the site of our compassion, curiosity, confidence, calmness, clarity, courage, connectedness, joy, the justice we give ourselves. So give yourselves some justice today. Gandhi once said, "When I despair, I remember that throughout history, the ways of truth and love have always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they can seem invincible, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. The result of joyful, good trouble, this justice giving, is not a bloody revolution, but a gentle, never-ending dissolution, a wearing away through truth, through joy, through love, a gentle wearing away of the powers that do harm. May it be so, and blessed be."
In the words of Reverend Kathleen McTeague, may the light around us guide our footsteps and hold us fast to the best and most righteous that we seek. May the darkness around us nurture our dreams and give us rest so that we may give ourselves to the work of the world. Let us seek to remember the wholeness of our lives, the weaving of life and shadow, and the great and outstanding dance that we live in and move in. As we extinguish our chalice flame, please join me in reciting together our Peace Fellowship blessing. Bless us with hope, bless us with fire,
bless us with love, bless all we share. Blessed be